She was 70 years old, limping through a crowded diner, and not one person would let her sit down. Not the retired couple, not the construction workers, not the young mother with two kids. They all smiled politely and looked away. But when she approached the table where a Hells Angels biker sat alone, he didn't smile. He didn't make excuses. He just pulled out the chair and said one word, sit. What he discovered in the next 60 seconds would unravel a secret that had been hiding in plain sight for 3 years. A secret that would destroy one man and expose every single person who chose not to see. Before we begin, if you are watching from anywhere in the world, drop your location in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe because this story will change how you see the people around you. Now let me tell you about Eleanor Hartwell and the day she refused to disappear. She was 70 years old, limping through a crowded diner at noon on a Tuesday, and not one person would let her sit down. Eleanor Hartwell had counted on this. She'd counted on the way respectable people avert their eyes when something uncomfortable asks for their attention. She was 70 years old, limping through a crowded diner at noon on a Tuesday, and not one person would let her sit down. Eleanor Hartwell had counted on this. She'd counted on the way respectable people avert their eyes when something uncomfortable asks for their attention. She'd counted on politeness being stronger than compassion, on the human instinct to avoid complications, to trust that someone else would help, that someone else would see. 6 tables, 6 refusals. The retired couple by the window smiled with practiced sympathy and gestured toward the coffee-stained booth they'd already claimed, though only 2 seats of 4 were occupied. The construction crew near the jukebox didn't even look up from their burgers' heads, bent in that universal posture of people who've decided you don't exist. The young mother with 2 small children offered an apologetic grimace and muttered something about saving the space for her husband, though the diaper bag sprawled across the empty chair suggested he wouldn't be arriving anytime soon. Eleanor understood. She'd taught second grade for 34 years in this town. She knew human nature, knew that most people aren't cruel, just careful. Careful not to get involved, careful not to make assumptions, careful not to be the one who opens a door they might not be able to close. She had 2 hours. 2 hours before Garrett returned from his meeting in Helena, 90 miles north. 2 hours to find someone who would believe a 70-year-old woman who'd been told she was crazy for so long she'd almost started believing it herself. 2 hours to save her own life. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and fryer grease, that particular American perfume of diners that have been serving the same menu since 1973. Riverside Diner. Eleanor had eaten here hundreds of times when she was teaching, back when she could come and go as she pleased, back when her Tuesdays belonged to her and not to a nephew who locked doors from the outside. She moved through the narrow aisle between booths, her limp more pronounced than it had been 3 years ago. That wasn't Garrett's doing, not directly. That was what happened when you spent months favoring your left side because your right hip screamed every time the temperature in your 10 by 12-foot room dropped below 50 degrees. That was what happened when you walked in circles for exercise because walking in a straight line required more than 12 feet of space. Her coat was buttoned to her throat despite the warmth inside the diner. Beneath it, she wore layers, 4 of them. Not because it was cold outside, it was 75 degrees under a Montana sky so blue it hurt to look at, but because wearing layers had become a reflex. When you've spent 2 winters shivering in a converted garage while your nephew controlled the thermostat, you learned to dress for survival, not weather. And then there was the table in the corner. A man sat alone, back to the wall, newspaper spread before him. He wore a leather vest over a black t-shirt, the vest carrying patches that identified him as clearly as a uniform. Hells Angels, Montana chapter. A skull with wings, words stitched in Gothic script that Eleanor's failing eyes couldn't quite make out from this distance, but she didn't need to read them to understand what they meant. Outlaw. She'd learned something in 3 years of captivity, something they don't teach you in college or Sunday school or the teacher's lounge. She'd learned that respectable people are the most dangerous because everyone trusts them, everyone believes them. When a well-dressed man with a good job and a clean house tells authorities that his elderly aunt is declining, suffering from dementia, becoming a danger to herself, they believe him. But outlaws know what it's like when the system doesn't protect you, when respectability is a weapon used against you, when the people who should help are the ones who look away. Eleanor Hartwell made her choice. She approached his table, each step a negotiation between her hip and her will. Up close, she could see the details the distance had hidden. Gray threaded through his beard like wire through dark fabric. His hands wrapped around a white ceramic coffee mug were scarred across the knuckles, the kind of scars that come from impact from connection with hard surfaces or harder men. He was reading the obituaries. She noticed that, not the front page, not sports, not even the local news. The obituaries. The section people read when they're looking for names, they recognize when they're counting the dead and wondering when their own name will appear there. Someone who reads obituaries understands loss. She stopped beside his table. He didn't look up. "Excuse me, sir?" Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended, 3 years of being told to be quiet having done their work. She cleared her throat, tried again. "May I sit with you?" For 3 seconds, he didn't move, didn't acknowledge her. The diner noise continued around them, the clatter of plates, the hiss of the griddle, a child's bright laugh cutting through adult conversation. Eleanor felt the weight of those 3 seconds like stones in her pockets pulling her down. Then he reached out without lifting his eyes from the page, pulled out the chair across from him, and said one word. "Sit." Not a question, not an invitation, a statement. Permission and command at once. Eleanor sat. She'd been standing for so long, the act of sitting in a chair someone else had pulled out for her felt like a kind of mercy she'd forgotten existed. Her purse's zipper broken months ago settled into her lap. Inside it, tucked between crumpled receipts and the emergency $20 bills she'd been hiding for 6 months, was a key to a storage unit she'd rented 2 years earlier, back when she still controlled enough of her own money to afford $35 a month. Back when she'd still believed she might need to build a case instead of just surviving one more day. The man still hadn't looked at her, but Eleanor was looking at him, really looking the way she'd learned to look during 3 years of cataloging details of reading threats in the angle of a door left open, or the tone of footsteps on concrete. His watch, visible beneath the cuff of his leather vest, carried an engraving she could just make out. USMC, United States Marine Corps, so a veteran. Someone who understood discipline structure, the importance of following through on commitments. Someone who'd been trained to see threats, to assess situations, to act when action was required. His newspaper was folded to show the obituaries, yes, but beside it lay a book spine up. A biography of some kind. She couldn't read the title, but the fact that he was reading at all, reading something substantial, told her this was a man who thought, who considered, who didn't just react. And his hands. Those scarred, careful hands that had pulled out a chair for a stranger without hesitation. Hands that knew work and hardship and probably violence, but hands that performed a small act of courtesy as naturally as breathing. Eleanor had been a teacher long enough to read people. You didn't survive 34 years in elementary education without learning to assess a room in seconds, to identify the child who needed extra attention and the child who needed space, to spot the parent who would be your ally and the one who would fight you at every turn. This man, she decided, knew loss. And people who know loss recognize it in others. A waitress appeared young, maybe late 20s, with tired eyes and a smile that didn't quite reach them. Faye, her name tag read. Eleanor recognized her, though the girl wouldn't remember. 6 months ago, Eleanor had managed to escape for 45 minutes and had come to the same diner, sat at a different table, ordered coffee she could barely afford, and left a $20 tip on a $2.50 tab. A test, to see if kindness still existed, to see if anyone would remember. "What can I get you, hun?" Faye asked, her pen already poised over her order pad. The question, mechanical, rehearsed, asked without expectation of an interesting answer. Eleanor ordered coffee and toast, nothing else. Her stomach had shrunk over the past year, Garrett's portions growing smaller as his impatience grew larger, and she'd learned that eating too much too fast after prolonged hunger could make you sick. She'd learned a lot of things she'd never wanted to know. When Faye walked away, Eleanor finally met the man's eyes. They were dark, almost black, set deep beneath heavy brows. Eyes that had seen things done, things survived things. Eyes that didn't flinch away from an old woman's desperation, because they'd learned that looking away was its own kind of cowardice. "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly. He nodded once, a minimal acknowledgement, and returned his attention to the paper. But he was listening. She could tell by the way he'd stopped reading, the way his eyes had ceased their left-to-right scanning motion, even though they remained fixed on the page. Eleanor's coffee arrived. Black like she'd ordered steam rising in small wisps that dissipated before reaching the ceiling. She wrapped both hands around the mug, feeling its warmth seep into her fingers. 3 years ago, this would have been too hot to hold. Now, after so many nights shivering under insufficient blankets, heat was something to be absorbed, stored, cherished. She took a sip, burnt and bitter and absolutely perfect. The toast came 2 slices of white bread, toasted to just shy of burnt butter, melting into the surface. Eleanor picked up one piece, holding it carefully, and took a small bite. Mechanical. Precise. Like someone who'd learned to ration to make food last, to never assume there would be more. The man watched her now. She could feel it, though. When she glanced up, his eyes were still on his newspaper. But peripheral vision can be more honest than direct gaze, and she saw the subtle shift in his posture, the way his shoulders had angled slightly toward her, the universal body language of attention being paid. This was the moment where she could speak or stay silent, could take the risk or retreat into safety. Safety had been killing her for 3 years, slowly, methodically, degree by degree. "I'm not supposed to be outside," Eleanor said. The words dropped into the space between them, like stones into still water, small splash spreading ripples. The man's hand, reaching for his coffee mug, paused, resumed its movement, lifted the cup, set it down without drinking. He turned the page of his newspaper, a gesture so casual it was almost certainly performed to give him something to do with his hands while he processed what she just said. "Says who?" His voice was exactly what she'd expected. Gravel and smoke, low and steady, the kind of voice that didn't waste words because it had learned they were currency to be spent carefully. "My nephew." Eleanor kept her own voice, even matter-of-fact reporting rather than pleading. "Garrett, he says I might get confused. Wander off." The man didn't respond immediately. A truck rumbled past outside its engine, rattling the diner's front window. Someone laughed too loud at the counter, the laugh cutting off abruptly, as if remembering that joy should be moderated in public spaces. "Do you?" the man asked. "Get confused?" Eleanor set down her toast, met his eyes directly. "I've never been confused a day in my life, sir." Something shifted in his expression. Not softening exactly. Men like this didn't soften, she suspected, but something like recognition. Like he'd just seen a pattern, he knew a code he could read. He folded his newspaper the first time he'd given her his full attention. "Name's Cole." "Eleanor, Ellie if you prefer." "Ma'am works fine." They sat in silence for a moment. Around them, the diner continued its familiar rhythm, oblivious to the small tragedy unfolding in the corner booth. The construction workers paid their bill and left boots heavy on the linoleum. The young mother wiped ketchup from her son's face with a napkin dampened with her own spit, the universal gesture of mothers everywhere. The retired couple debated whether to order pie, speaking in the comfortable shorthand of people who'd been together so long they'd worn grooves in their conversations. Eleanor glanced at the clock on the wall. 12:17. She had an hour and 43 minutes. She reached into her purse, that sad, broken zippered thing that Garrett permitted her to carry, because what harm could an old woman's purse do, and pulled out a crumpled $5 bill. The toast and coffee would cost $3.50. She knew the prices by heart, had known them for decades. The extra $1.50 was calculated. Enough to be noticed, not enough to be questioned. As she set the bill on the table, her hand trembled. Not from fear, though. Fear was certainly there, a constant companion these days. The tremor was exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd been holding herself together through sheer force of will for longer than should be possible. The purse slipped from her lap as she stood. Contents scattered across the worn linoleum. Receipts, a tissue, a small notepad, and a key. The key skittered across the floor, stopping just inches from Cole's boot. He bent to retrieve it, his movement economical, efficient. Picked it up between thumb and forefinger, examining it the way someone examines anything that's landed unexpectedly in their space. A small brass key attached to a metal tag stamped with fading letters. Pine Grove Storage, Unit 47, Riverside, Montana. He looked up at Eleanor, key balanced in his palm, question in his eyes. And Eleanor, who had been planning this moment for 4 months, who had practiced the exact sequence of movements required to make a deliberate action appear accidental, met his gaze and let him see, just for a second, the truth. This was not an accident. Then she blinked and the mask slid back into place, the mask of a confused old woman who'd simply dropped her purse, and she said, "Oh goodness, I'm sorry, so clumsy," and reached for the key. But Cole didn't give it back. Not immediately. He held it for 3 seconds. 4. His eyes moving from the key to her face and back again, and Eleanor knew he was reading the message she'd encoded in metal and circumstance. If you care, you'll investigate. If you don't, you'll hand it back and forget. She held her breath. He stood, this large man in leather, in patches, in judgment from a society that had written him off as dangerous, and he held out the key. But as Eleanor took it, his other hand moved to his vest pocket, pulled out a scrap of paper and a pen, wrote something quickly and pressed it into her palm along with the key. A phone number. Nothing else. No name, no explanation. Just 10 digits that might mean salvation or might mean nothing. Eleanor closed her fingers around the key, and the paper nodded once and turned to leave. She was at the door when his voice reached her, quiet enough that only she could hear it over the diner noise. "Ma'am," she paused, didn't turn around. "If you're in trouble," Cole said, "rouse trouble, that number works. Day or night." Eleanor Hartwell, who had not cried in 3 years because crying was weakness, and Garrett fed on weakness, like some people feed on bread, felt her throat close. She nodded again, not trusting her voice, and walked out into the bright Montana afternoon. The taxi she'd called from the payphone at the gas station 2 blocks away was waiting, the same driver who'd brought her into town, a middle-aged man who'd accepted her story about visiting her nephew and needing a ride without question. People rarely questioned old women. That was both their shield and their prison. As the taxi pulled away from the curb, Eleanor looked back at the diner. Cole stood in the window watching her leave, his silhouette dark against the bright interior. She had 1 hour and 26 minutes to get back to Garrett's house, to pick the lock on her prison door, to slip back into her room and arrange herself on the narrow bed as if she'd been there all along. 1 hour and 26 minutes before Garrett returned and checked on her as he always did, his smile pleasant and his eyes cold, asking if she'd had a good day, knowing she had nowhere to go, nothing to do, no one to see. Except today she'd gone, and someone had noticed. And tomorrow, if Cole was the man she believed him to be, someone would start asking questions. Eleanor pressed the key and the phone number into her palm until the metal bit her skin, until she could feel the imprint of hope against her flesh. She had made the first move. Now she waited to see if the universe would move with her, or if she'd simply spent her last 2 hours of freedom on a gamble that would come up empty. The taxi turned onto Garrett's Street, and Eleanor felt the familiar dread settle over her shoulders like a winter coat. The house looked normal from the outside, well-maintained, respectable. The kind of house that suggested comfortable middle-class life, good neighbors, nothing to see here. The converted garage where she lived was around back, out of sight from the street. Convenient for Garrett. No one could see the bars on the window he'd installed 6 months ago, the ones he'd explained away as security against break-ins, though they both knew the only thing being secured was her. The taxi stopped at the curb. Eleanor paid, added a small tip, smiled her pleasant old lady smile, and climbed out with the careful movements of someone whose body had learned to expect pain. 1:04, 56 minutes. She walked up the driveway past Garrett's house, around to the back. The garage conversion stood separate from the main structure, connected by a short breezeway that Garrett had enclosed with latticework and locked from the outside. Eleanor had her hidden screwdriver tucked into the lining of her coat, the one she'd been working loose from an old paint can she'd found in the corner of her room 4 months ago. She'd practiced with it, learned the feel of the lock, the way it caught and released the angle required to convince cheap hardware to betray its purpose. It took her 8 minutes. Her hands shook, whether from fear or effort, she couldn't say. But the lock clicked open, and Eleanor slipped inside her prison, locked it behind her from the outside, using a bent paperclip she'd hidden in a crack in the doorframe, and moved through the dim space to her bed. The room was exactly as she'd left it that morning after Garrett had brought her breakfast and left for his meeting. Narrow bed with its thin mattress and insufficient blankets. Small dresser with 3 drawers, one of which stuck. A chair by the window, the barred window. A space heater that worked when Garrett decided it should work. No phone. No computer. No television. No radio. Nothing that connected to the outside world. Nothing that could be used to call for help or verify whether the stories Garrett told about her were true. Eleanor sat on the bed, carefully arranged her coat, Her purse positioned herself exactly as she'd been when Garrett last checked on her and waited. 1:39, 21 minutes. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a question. Would Cole investigate? Would he look at that storage unit? Would he find what she'd left there, the evidence she'd been gathering for 2 years, piece by precious piece? Or would he throw away the key, forget the strange old woman at the diner, go back to his life of leather and motorcycles and whatever else men like him did when they weren't pulling out chairs for desperate strangers? Eleanor closed her eyes and did what she'd been doing for 3 years. She recited poetry in her head. Frost Dickinson Tennyson. Lines she'd memorized as a girl and never forgotten. Lines that proved her mind was still hers, still sharp, still capable of holding beauty even when surrounded by ugliness. She'd just reached the third stanza of Stopping by Woods on a snowy evening when she heard it. The sound of Garrett's car pulling into the driveway. The engine cut, car door open, closed. Footsteps on concrete moving toward the main house, not toward her. Eleanor breathed. In through her nose, out through her mouth, the way she'd taught anxious second graders to breathe before tests. 5 minutes passed. 10. Then the footsteps again moving towards her, now purposeful, steady, the rattle of keys, the click of the outer lock, the breezeway door opening. Garrett appeared in her doorway, backlit by the afternoon sun, his silhouette familiar and terrible. "Aunt Ellie," he said, his voice carrying that particular warmth that made her skin crawl, that false affection that people who didn't know him better would believe was genuine. "How are you feeling today?" Eleanor looked up at him, arranged her face into the expression she'd perfected over 3 years. Mild confusion, slight vacancy, the look of someone whose mind was starting to slip. "Tired," she said, her voice smaller than it had been at the diner, smaller than it had been when she told Cole she'd never been confused a day in her life. "I think I slept most of the day." Garrett nodded, satisfied. He believed her because he wanted to believe her, because her decline was what he needed, what he'd been orchestrating, what justified the locked doors and the isolation and the systematic erasure of a person. "That's fine," he said. "Rest is good for you. I brought dinner. I'll leave it in the kitchen. Come eat when you're ready." He didn't invite her into the main house. He never did. The kitchen he referenced was the small area in her converted garage, a microwave and a hot plate, and a mini fridge he stocked with whatever he decided she should eat. "Thank you, Garrett," Eleanor said, and watched him leave. The outer door locked. His footsteps retreated. The house settled back into its afternoon quiet. Eleanor sat on her bed alone in her prison and allowed herself one small smile, because in her pocket, pressed against her thigh, through the fabric of her coat, was a phone number. And somewhere in Riverside, Montana, a man in a leather vest was holding a key to Unit 47 at Pine Grove Storage, where 2 years of evidence waited to be found. She'd taken the first step. She'd asked to sit down, and someone had said yes. Now she waited to see if that yes would be enough. Cole Thatcher sat in his truck outside the Riverside Diner for 20 minutes after Eleanor left the storage unit key on the dashboard, catching afternoon light. He should drive away. Should drop the key in the lost and found, forget the old woman with the bruises on her wrists and the careful ways she'd eaten her toast piece by small piece, like someone who'd learned that food was currency, not to be wasted. Should mind his own business. Wyatt Kane would tell him to mind his own business. Wyatt, who'd been chapter president of the Montana Hells Angels for 15 years, who'd learned through hard experience that getting involved in civilian problems usually meant getting blamed when those problems exploded. But Cole had learned something different. He'd learned it in a nursing home in Billings 4 years ago, sitting beside a hospital bed, while his younger brother Marcus took his last breaths, lungs full of fluid, body covered in bed sores that should never have been allowed to develop. He'd learned that looking away has a cost. That minding your own business is sometimes just another phrase for letting evil happen, because stopping it would be inconvenient. Marcus had complained, had told Cole during those visits that were too infrequent, too brief, that the staff didn't come when he called, that his sheets weren't changed often enough, that something was wrong. And Cole had nodded and assumed Marcus was exaggerating because the place looked clean enough, because the staff smiled when Cole visited, because surely a licensed facility wouldn't let a patient deteriorate that badly. Surely someone was paying attention. No one had been paying attention. By the time the state inspectors finally investigated after Marcus died and Cole demanded an autopsy. The facility had cleaned up its act just enough to avoid criminal charges. Staff was fired, protocols were changed, and Marcus was still dead. Cole picked up the key. Pine Grove Storage was on the east side of Riverside, a collection of orange-doored units arranged in rows like metal dominoes surrounded by chain-link fence and monitored by a security camera that probably hadn't worked since 2015. He found Unit 47 on the second row, standard size maybe 10 by 10. Combination lock hanging from the latch numbers worn smooth from years of use. Cole pulled a pair of bolt cutters from his truck bed. He'd learned a long time ago that asking permission was often slower than asking forgiveness, and something about the way Eleanor had looked at him, the way she deliberately dropped that key, told him time mattered. The lock snapped clean. Cole pulled open the rolling door metal screeching against its track and stepped into the dim interior. The unit was almost empty. No furniture, no boxes of seasonal decorations, none of the usual detritus people stored when their homes got too full. Just 3 items arranged with deliberate care. A shoebox, a manila envelope, a composition notebook with a black and white marbled cover, the kind students used in elementary school. Cole pulled out his phone, turned on the flashlight, and opened the shoebox first. Inside, photocopies, bank statements, dozens of them arranged chronologically. Cole spread them out on the storage unit floor, his knees cracking as he knelt. Eleanor Hartwell's pension deposits regular as clockwork. $4,200 a month deposited on the first of every month from Montana Teachers Retirement System. And withdrawals. Electronic transfers, $3,800 a month, moved to an account belonging to Garrett Voss. Memo line living expenses, $400. That's what Eleanor was left with each month. $400 that never seemed to get spent if the account balance was accurate. Just accumulated month after month, suggesting she never had access to it. Cole moved to the manila envelope. Inside, more photocopies. A property deed showing Eleanor's house, the one she'd apparently lived in for 30 years, transferred to Garrett Voss for $1. Symbolic transfer, the document said. Date, November 2021. Life insurance documents. Beneficiary changed from someone named Claire Hartwell Memorial Fund to Garrett Voss. Date, March 2022. Medical records. Prescription refills for medications. Cole didn't recognize, but the attached note written in careful handwriting that matched the composition, notebook explained. Donepezil. Alzheimer's medication. I have never been prescribed this. I have never taken this. But according to these pharmacy records, Garrett has been picking up refills for 2 years. He must have forged a doctor's signature. Cole sat back on his heels, the evidence arranged around him like pieces of a puzzle that were starting to form a picture. A terrible picture. He opened the composition notebook last. The handwriting inside was small, precise, the penmanship of someone educated in an era when cursive mattered. But more than that, it was the handwriting of someone trying to fit as much information as possible into limited space, someone rationing even paper. The first entry was dated June 18th, 2022. Today, Garrett took my car keys. He says I'm not safe to drive. I am safe. I've been driving for 53 years without accident. But he showed me a video of me supposedly driving too slowly on the highway. The angle was wrong. I think he manipulated it. But I can't prove that, so I let him take the keys. Better to choose my battles. I'm starting to understand that this is a war and I need to conserve my strength. Cole flipped pages. Hundreds of entries, each dated, each detailing another small theft, another restriction, another lie. August 3rd, 2022. Garrett disconnected my phone, said I don't use it enough to justify the cost. I protested. He said he'd think about it. He won't think about it. September 12th, 2022. Today he installed a lock on my door. On the outside. He said it's temporary for my safety so I don't wander at night. I don't wander. But he's building a narrative. I see it now. He's going to claim I have dementia. He's going to lock me away and take everything and everyone will believe him because he's respectable. And I'm just an old woman who must be confused. October 30th, 2022. It's cold. The heater in my room isn't working. I asked Garrett to fix it. He said he'll get to it. That was 3 days ago. Last night I wore 4 layers to bed and still woke up shivering. I'm starting to understand this isn't neglect. This is strategy. January 15th, 2023. I haven't left this room in 2 months. Garrett brings my meals. He's cut the portions. I'm losing weight. When I mentioned it, he said the doctor recommended I lose weight. I haven't seen a doctor in over a year. Everything he tells me is a lie, but it's a lie everyone else believes. March 8th, 2023. I tried to get help today. I wrote a note. Help held prisoner and threw it out the window when I heard the neighbor in her yard. She found it, brought it to Garrett. He told her I have dementia, that I write confused things. She believed him. Why wouldn't she? He's a financial advisor. He volunteers at the food bank. He looks like someone who takes care of his elderly aunt. And I look like exactly what he says I am. A confused old woman. The entries continued, each one a small window into systematic abuse, into a woman being erased one day at a time. Cole kept reading. July 22nd, 2023. I've stopped trying to convince people directly. They don't believe me. Respectability is armor, and Garrett wears it well. So instead I document, I photocopy when I can, I write when I can't. I'm building a case because someday someone will listen. They have to. The alternative is that I die in this room and Garrett inherits everything and tells everyone I passed peacefully in my sleep, and no one will ever know. September 5th, 2023. I realized something today. Garrett isn't waiting for me to die naturally. He's creating conditions for me to die. The cold, the hunger, the isolation. He's learned you can kill someone without ever laying a hand on them. You just remove the things that keep them alive piece by piece and wait. The final entry was dated 2 weeks ago. March 15th, 2024. I overheard Garrett on the phone. He was asking someone about nursing homes in Wyoming, out of state. He's planning to move me. I think I know why. Montana has better elder protection laws. Wyoming is easier. And once I'm out of state, no one here will be able to track me. I'll just disappear. I have to act soon. I have to find someone who'll believe me before he makes his move. But who? Who believes the invisible Cole closed the notebook, his jaw tight. He pulled out his phone and called Wyatt. Yeah. Wyatt's voice carried the rasp of a man who'd smoked for 40 years before quitting and still sounded like he hadn't. I need you to meet me at Pine Grove Storage, East Side Unit 47. Silence. Then, this about that old lady from the diner. News traveled fast in a club where brothers looked out for each other. Cole must have mentioned her to someone, or someone had seen them talking and information had filtered up. Yeah, Cole said. We getting involved in something? Already involved. More silence, then be there in 20. Wyatt Kane arrived in 18 minutes, his Harley announcing him before he turned the corner. He was 58, built like a man who'd worked with his hands his entire life, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same rock as the Montana mountains. Gray hair pulled back in a ponytail. Scars on his knuckles from fights he'd won and fights he'd lost. Eyes that had seen too much to be shocked by much. He stood at the entrance to the storage unit, looked at the evidence spread across the floor, and said one word. Fuck. Yeah, Cole agreed. Wyatt picked up the notebook, flipped through it, his expression hardening with each page. This is systematic. Financial exploitation, false imprisonment, probably attempted murder if you consider the conditions. We calling the cops? Cole shook his head. Not yet. Look at this. He held up the entry about the neighbor, the one who'd found Eleanor's note and brought it to Garrett. Every time she's tried to get help, people believe him over her. He's got documentation, forged medical records, witnesses who will testify she's declining. If we go to the cops now without ironclad proof, it's her word against his. And his word is worth more because he's got a bomb and a clean record. Exactly. Wyatt set down the notebook. So what's the play? Cole thought for a moment. We need more. Current evidence, not just historical documentation. We need to catch him in the act. And we need someone official who'll take this seriously. Sheriff Raines, Cole nodded. Tom Raines was a good cop, one of the few in Riverside who didn't automatically assume Hell's Angels meant trouble. He and Wyatt had served together in Desert Storm back before Wyatt had come home and found he couldn't fit back into civilian life the way it was supposed to fit. Raines had gone into law enforcement. Wyatt had gone into motorcycles and brotherhood. But they'd stayed friends in their way. We bring this to Raines, he'll need more than a notebook, Wyatt said. He'll need current evidence, active crime. Then we watch, Cole said. We document. We make this bastard nervous enough that he makes a mistake. And the old lady Eleanor, she's still in there, still locked up. Wyatt was quiet for a moment, his jaw working. We can't leave her in there, Cole. If we pull her out now, Garrett destroys evidence and claims she wandered off confused. We need her cooperation, need her to help us nail this shut. She's 70 years old and being starved. I know. You know, but you're saying wait anyway. Cole met Wyatt's eyes. I'm saying we do this right. We do this fast, but we do it right. Because if we fuck this up, she goes back to him, and we've made things worse. Wyatt stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. 48 hours. We give this 48 hours. Then we pull her out whether we've got enough evidence or not. Agreed. They locked the storage unit back up, Cole replacing the cut lock with a new one he had in his truck, pocketing the key. The evidence stayed inside safe, waiting to be used. As they stood beside their bikes, Wyatt said, "You know what gets me about all this?" "What?" "She didn't ask us to save her. She asked if she could sit down. That's all. Just wanted permission to exist in the same space as another human being." Wyatt shook his head. 3 years this bastard's been erasing her, and all she wanted was someone to say yes to the simplest request. Cole thought about Eleanor's face as she'd left the diner, the way she'd paused when he'd given her his number, the small nod that carried more weight than words. "Then we make sure he doesn't erase her," Cole said. "We make sure she gets more than just a seat at a table. We make sure she gets her life back." "Yeah." They rode back toward town, the afternoon sun beginning its slow descent toward the mountains. Somewhere in Riverside, in a converted garage with bars on the windows, Eleanor Hartwell sat in her prison waiting to see if the universe would finally decide she was worth saving. Cole intended to make sure the answer was yes. Eleanor heard Garrett leave the house at 7:15 the next morning. His car engine starting, tires crunching on gravel, the sound fading as he drove toward his job at First National Bank, where he managed accounts and gave financial advice and smiled at customers who believed he was trustworthy. She waited 10 minutes. Standard procedure. Garrett had doubled back before claiming he had forgotten something, testing to see if she'd try to leave the moment he was gone. 10 minutes passed. The house remained quiet. Eleanor stood from her bed, moved to her door, and pulled out the bent paper clip she kept hidden in a crack in the door frame. The lock took her 4 minutes today, faster than yesterday. Practice made perfect, even when you were 70 and your hands shook from cold and hunger. The door opened. Eleanor stepped into the breezeway, then into the main house. She had perhaps 3 hours before Garrett would return on his lunch break to check on her, to bring her a sandwich, with the crust cut off, to ask how she was feeling, with that smile that never reached his eyes. 3 hours to do what needed to be done. Eleanor moved through the house like a ghost, her footsteps silent on carpet she'd helped him pick out 3 years ago, back when she'd still believed this was temporary, that his help was genuine, that family meant safety. She'd learned better. Garrett's office was on the second floor, a room he kept locked, but Eleanor had found his spare key months ago, hidden in a kitchen drawer beneath a stack of takeout menus. She'd memorized where he kept it, studied the pattern of his movements, waited for moments like this. The office door opened. Inside, everything was exactly as Garrett wanted it. Organized, professional, a desk with a computer, file cabinet, shelves lined with financial planning books. Eleanor didn't have much time. She moved to the file cabinet, pulled open the second drawer. Inside, hanging folders labeled with clinical precision. Utilities, insurance, medical, investments. She found what she was looking for in the folder labeled estate planning. Documents showing that upon her death, Garrett would inherit everything. The remains of her pension, her life insurance, the house he'd already legally transferred to his name, but would increase in value when he sold it. Net worth approximately $540,000. That's what her life was worth to him. Just over $500,000, enough to clear his debts, restart his life, move somewhere new, and pretend the past few years hadn't happened. Eleanor pulled out the small disposable camera she'd bought 6 months ago, back when she could still occasionally convince the UPS driver to take her to the store by claiming that she needed to pick up her own packages. She photographed the documents, each click of the shutter, a small act of rebellion. She moved to Garrett's computer. It was password protected, but Eleanor had watched him type it in enough times when she'd still been allowed upstairs, back before the isolation had become total. She typed Sarah 2013, her daughter's name, and the year she'd died. Garrett using Claire's death as his password felt like desecration, but it worked. The computer unlocked. Eleanor didn't have time to search thoroughly. She opened his browser history, knowing he probably thought she was too old, too confused to understand technology. He was wrong. The search history showed queries from the past month. Wyoming nursing homes accepting emergency admissions. Montana to Wyoming patient transfer laws. How long does hypothermia take in elderly? Starvation timeline symptoms. Eleanor's hands shook as she photographed the screen. This was it. This was proof not just of what he'd done, but of what he'd planned. Premeditation. Intent. She heard it then. The sound that made her blood freeze. A car in the driveway. Garrett's car. Eleanor's mind raced. He wasn't supposed to be back for 2 more hours. Something had changed. Something had gone wrong. She had perhaps 90 seconds before he came inside. Eleanor shut down the computer, closed the file cabinet, pocketed the camera. Moved toward the office door, out into the hallway, down the stairs as quickly as her hip would allow. The front door was opening as she reached the main floor. She diverted toward the kitchen, grabbed a glass from the cabinet, filled it with water at the sink, composed her face into confused surprise as Garrett walked in. Aunt Ellie. His voice carried suspicion and concern in equal measure. What are you doing up here? Eleanor turned glass in hand and called on 34 years of teaching experience of managing classrooms full of children who could smell fear, like sharks smell blood. I was thirsty, she said, her voice small but steady. The water in my room tastes funny. I thought I'd get some from the kitchen. Garrett's eyes scanned the kitchen, looking for signs of disturbance, evidence that she'd been anywhere other than where she claimed. You shouldn't be up here, he said. You might fall on the stairs. I was careful. You could have called me. I would have brought you water. You weren't home. I am now. I forgot some paperwork. They stared at each other across the kitchen island, nephew and aunt jailer, and prisoner, predator, and prey. Go back to your room, Aunt Ellie, Garrett said, his voice gentle, implacable. I'll bring you lunch in an hour. Eleanor nodded, set down the glass, and walked past him toward the breezeway. She could feel his eyes on her back, assessing, calculating, wondering if he'd underestimated her. Let him wonder. She reached her room, heard the outer lock click shut behind her, and sat on her bed. The disposable camera was still in her pocket, pressing against her thigh. Evidence of his plans. Proof that this wasn't neglect, wasn't just poor judgment, but calculated, systematic, attempted murder. Eleanor pulled out the scrap of paper Cole had given her, the phone number, written in blunt pencil, probably taken from behind a diner counter. She didn't have a phone. Garrett had made sure of that. But she had something else. She had hope. And tomorrow was Wednesday. Tomorrow, Garrett had a standing meeting at the bank every Wednesday at 2 p.m., a meeting that lasted exactly 1 hour. Tomorrow, she'd have time to get to the payphone at the gas station 3 blocks away. Tomorrow, she'd call the number and hope that the man who'd said yes when she asked to sit down would say yes again when she asked for something harder. She'd ask him to believe her. She'd ask him to help her disappear, not the way Garrett wanted her to disappear, into a grave or a crematorium erased from memory and record. She'd ask him to help her disappear into safety just long enough to build the case that would put Garrett behind bars. Eleanor lay down on her narrow bed, the camera hidden beneath her mattress, and did what she'd been doing for 3 years. She survived. One more day, one more night, one more breath. Until the moment came when surviving turned into fighting back, when being invisible became being unforgettable, when the woman everyone had overlooked reminded them all that she was still here, still breathing, still thinking. Closed her eyes and recited Tennyson and closed her eyes and recited Tennyson in her head, the words, a talisman against the dark. Though much is taken, much abides. And tomorrow she would make sure that what abides was not Garrett's victory, but her own refusal to be erased. Tomorrow the war would truly begin. Wednesday arrived with the kind of crystalline Montana morning that made people forget winter ever happened. Eleanor watched the sunrise through her barred window, counting the minutes until Garrett's banking meeting, the one that would give her exactly 60 minutes of freedom. She'd spent the night memorizing what she needed to say. 10 digits, 1 chance. No room for confusion or hesitation or the trembling voice of an old woman who'd forgotten how to ask for help without apologizing for needing it. At 1:47 p.m., she heard Garrett's car leave, heard the engine fade, counted to 200 the way she'd learned to count because 90 seconds wasn't enough and 5 minutes was too long, and somewhere in between was the sweet spot where caution met necessity. At count 200, Eleanor picked the lock. It took her 3 minutes today. The paperclip was wearing down the metal, fatiguing from repeated use, and she'd need to find another one soon. But today it held. Today the lock clicked open and Eleanor stepped out into air that didn't smell like her own captivity. The gas station was 3 blocks east. Eleanor had mapped the route in her head during the hundreds of hours she'd spent staring at her ceiling, tracing the path she'd walked 1,000 times when she'd been free, when 3 blocks was nothing barely worth noticing. Now 3 blocks felt like a marathon. Her hips screamed with each step. The limp she'd tried to hide at the diner was impossible to conceal, now her body protesting movement. It had been denied for too long. But Eleanor had learned something about pain in the past 3 years. You could walk through it. You could breathe through it. You could survive it if the alternative was worse. And the alternative was staying in that room until Garrett decided it was time for her to stop breathing altogether. The payphone outside the Shell station was ancient, a relic from an era before everyone carried computers in their pockets. It smelled like motor oil and cigarette smoke, the receiver sticky against Eleanor's ear. She fed quarters into the slot metal, clicking against metal, and dialed the number she'd memorized. It rang once, twice. On the third ring, Cole answered. Yeah, one word, same gravel and smoke voice from the diner, carrying the same economy of language that suggested he didn't waste breath on unnecessary pleasantries. It's Eleanor, she said, from the diner. You told me to call if I was in trouble. Silence. Not the silence of disconnection, but of attention being focused, of a man shifting mental gears from whatever he'd been doing to this moment, this call, this person who needed him. Where are you? Cole asked. Shell station on Riverside Boulevard. I have 42 minutes before I need to be back. Back where? My nephew's house, the garage, where he locks me in. More silence, then stay there, I'm coming. No, Eleanor said quickly. Don't come here. He might drive by, might see. I just need to tell you something. She heard the sound of an engine starting, motorcycle pipes rumbling to life. Cole was moving anyway, but he said, I'm listening. Eleanor gripped the phone tighter. Did you find the storage unit? Yeah. Did you read the notebook? Every word. Something in Eleanor's chest loosened just slightly. Someone had read her words. Someone knew. She wasn't alone anymore in the knowing. There's more, she said. I got into his computer yesterday, photographed his search history. He's been researching how to kill me, how long hypothermia takes, starvation timelines. He's planning to move me out of state to a nursing home in Wyoming. I think that's where he intends to finish this. Cole's voice when it came was different, harder. How long do we have? I don't know, days maybe. He's getting nervous. I can see it. Something's making him anxious. That would be us, Eleanor blinked. What? My club. We've been watching him, making ourselves visible, letting him know someone's paying attention. You've been protecting me. We've been applying pressure, making him sloppy. People make mistakes when they're scared. Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. She felt it in the straightening of her spine, the steadying of her voice, the sudden clarity that came with understanding she wasn't fighting alone anymore. I need to go back, she said. Like hell you do. If I disappear now, he destroys evidence and claims I wandered off. You said it yourself, he needs to make mistakes. I'm the bait that keeps him from running. Cole's exhale crackled through the phone line. That's a hell of a risk, ma'am. I've been at risk for 3 years. At least now it's a calculated one. If he hurts you, he's been hurting me. The question is whether we stop him before he finishes the job. Eleanor glanced at her watch. 36 minutes. I have to go, but I need you to do something. Name it. Get those photographs I took. The camera's hidden in my room under the mattress left corner. You'll need to get in when Garrett's not there. That's breaking and entering. So is locking someone in a garage for 3 years? Cole made a sound that might have been a laugh in a different context. Fair point. When tomorrow, Thursday, Garrett has a doctor's appointment at 10. He'll be gone 90 minutes minimum. The lock on the breezeway door is a standard tumbler. Can you pick it? Yeah. Then come tomorrow, get the camera, develop the photos, add them to the evidence. And I'll be exactly where he left me, confused old Aunt Ellie who doesn't know what day it is. Except you know exactly what day it is. Every single one, Eleanor said quietly. I've counted them all. She hung up before he could argue further, before her own fear could override the clarity that had settled over her like armor. 33 minutes to walk 3 blocks, pick a lock, arrange herself on a bed as if she'd never left. 33 minutes to slip back into her cage before the jailer noticed the door had been opened. Eleanor walked. Cole stood outside Garrett Voss's house at 10:07 a.m. on Thursday, watching the man's silver Lexus disappear around the corner. Wyatt was 3 blocks away on his bike, eyes on the road ready to signal if Garrett returned early. The house was exactly what Cole expected. Well-maintained, respectable, the kind of property that suggested comfortable middle-class success. Lawn mowed in precise diagonal lines, flower beds mulched and weeded. Nothing to indicate that behind the pleasant facade someone was being systematically erased. Cole moved around back where the converted garage stood separate from the main house. The breezeway door Eleanor had described was their latticework walls offering privacy from neighbors, a simple tumbler lock that took Cole 45 seconds to pick. He'd learned lockpicking in the Marines during training exercises that required entry into buildings without alerting occupants. The skill had served him well over the years, though usually in contexts less morally clear than retrieving evidence for a woman being held prisoner. The breezeway opened into Eleanor's room. Cole had seen bad situations before. Had walked into homes where neglect was obvious, where the smell hit you before the visual evidence did. This wasn't like that. This was clean, organized, almost sterile in its efficiency, which somehow made it worse. The room was exactly what Eleanor had described in her notebook. 10 by 12 feet. Single window with bars welded to the exterior frame, the kind of bars that couldn't be removed without power tools. A narrow bed with a thin mattress. Small dresser, chair by the window. No phone jack, no cable outlet, no internet router. Nothing that connected to the outside world. A space heater sat in the corner unplugged. Cole knelt beside it, examined the heating element. Half the coils were burned out, rendering it essentially useless. Whether that was intentional or neglect, the result was the same. Eleanor had spent winters in this room with insufficient heat. He moved to the bed, lifted the mattress at the left corner. The disposable camera was there exactly where she'd said it would be. Cole pocketed it, lowered the mattress, adjusted the blanket to match the position he'd found it in. But he didn't leave. Not yet. Cole stood in the center of Eleanor's prison and really looked. The walls showed faint scratches, marks that suggested someone had tested their strength looking for weak points. The window bars had small notches where something metal had scraped against them, probably the same paperclip Eleanor used to pick the lock, testing whether the bars could be loosened. Evidence of a woman who hadn't just accepted her captivity, who'd probed every possibility of escape, documented every failure, and kept trying anyway. On the small dresser sat a composition notebook different from the one in the storage unit. Cole opened it. More entries, recent ones covering the past few weeks. Eleanor's handwriting was shakier in these pages, her hand less steady, but the content was just as precise. March 20th, 2024. Garrett is nervous. I can see it in the way he checks on me more frequently, the way his questions feel like interrogations. Something has changed. I think someone is watching him. I hope someone is watching him. March 22nd, 2024. I made the call, spoke to Cole. He's helping. They're all helping. For the first time in 3 years, I'm not alone in this. I need to remember that when the fear gets bad, I'm not alone anymore. March 25th, 2024. Tomorrow that I help them get the evidence. Tomorrow we move one step closer to ending this. I'm so tired. But tired isn't the same as defeated. I learned that distinction somewhere between year 1 and year 2. Tired is just what happens to bodies. Defeated is what happens to spirits. My body may be tired, but my spirit is sharp as ever. Cole closed the notebook, returned it to its exact position. His phone buzzed. Text from Wyatt. Subject heading back, ETA 4 minutes. Cole moved through the room one more time, checking that everything was exactly as he'd found it. Touched nothing that didn't need touching. Left no trace of his presence. He locked the breezeway door behind him as he left the tumbler, clicking into place, and was around the front of the house and on his bike 30 seconds before Garrett's Lexus turned onto the street. Cole didn't look back as he rode away. Didn't need to. The camera in his pocket felt heavier than it should, its weight representing more than plastic and film. It represented hope. Evidence. The possibility that someone who'd been invisible for 3 years might finally be seen. He drove straight to the 1-hour photo place on Main Street, the kind of aging business that still existed in small towns where not everyone had switched to digital. Handed the camera to a teenager who looked barely old enough to operate the equipment and said he'd wait. 47 minutes later, Cole held the photographs. They were damning. Eleanor had photographed everything: estate planning documents showing Garrett as sole beneficiary, financial records documenting the systematic theft of her pension, medical files with forged prescriptions, and the computer screen Garrett's search history preserved in brutal clarity. How long does hypothermia take in elderly? Starvation timeline symptoms. Wyoming nursing homes accepting emergency admissions. Montana death investigation protocols. This wasn't a man caring for his declining aunt. This was a man planning a murder and documenting his research. Cole called Wyatt. Got the photos. We need Rains now. Clubhouse, 20 minutes. Sheriff Tom Rains sat at the scarred wooden table in the Hells Angels clubhouse, surrounded by men in leather vests covered in patches. He'd spent 28 years of law enforcement learning not to judge by their appearance. He'd known Wyatt Kane since Desert Storm, back when they'd both been young and stupid and convinced they were immortal. War had taught them otherwise, had taught them that mortality was constant, that death played no favorites, and that the only thing standing between you and oblivion was the person watching your back. Wyatt had been that person for Tom more times than he could count. So when Wyatt called and said he needed Tom to look at something off the record, Tom came. Now he sat looking at evidence spread across the table, and his cop's instinct was warring with his disbelief that something like this could happen in his town under his watch, without anyone noticing. How long has this been going on? Tom asked. 3 years, Cole said, according to her documentation. Started small, taking her car keys, disconnecting her phone, escalated to financial control, then physical imprisonment. Tom picked up one of the photographs, the one showing Garrett's search history. And she got these how? Got into his computer while he was out. Documented everything. That's illegal search. So is holding someone prisoner. Tom set down the photo. I'm not saying it isn't. I'm saying a defense attorney will argue these photos are inadmissible. Fruit of the poisonous tree. Wyatt leaned forward. Then we get you a warrant. Legal search. Find the evidence the right way. Warrant requires probable cause. You've got 3 years of documented abuse in that notebook. You've got forged medical prescriptions. You've got financial exploitation. That's not probable cause. Tom was quiet for a moment, reading through Eleanor's notebook entries, his expression growing darker with each page. This woman, Eleanor Hartwell, I knew her. She taught my daughter, Emily Rains, 3rd grade back in 2003. Mrs. Hartwell was the one who figured out Emily was dyslexic, got her the help she needed. He looked up at Cole and Wyatt. She's sharp, always was. If she says her nephew is doing this, I believe her. So you'll help? Cole asked. I'll do my job, which means I investigate. Properly. Legally. Tom gathered the photographs, the notebook, the bank statements. But I'm going to need to talk to her. Get her statement on record. That's a problem, Cole said. She's still in there. Still locked up. If we pull her out before we have enough to arrest him, he destroys evidence and claims she wandered off confused. And if we wait too long, he moves her out of state, or worse. Tom rubbed his jaw, thinking, how often does he leave the house? Regular schedule, banking job 9 to 5 weekdays, grocery shopping Saturdays, church Sundays. So we could interview her during his work hours. Recorded statement, sworn affidavit. That plus the physical evidence might be enough for a warrant to search his house and computers. When? Wyatt asked. Tomorrow, Friday. I'll bring Detective Sterling. She specializes in elder abuse cases. We'll need video documentation of the living conditions, Eleanor's testimony, medical examination if she'll consent. Cole nodded. I'll let her know. She's got a way to contact me. Tom stood, gathered the evidence. This stays between us until we move. I don't want Garrett Voss getting wind of an investigation and disappearing before we can charge him. He's not going anywhere, Cole said. We're making sure of that. Tom looked at the photographs one more time, his jaw tight. 3 years, right here in Riverside, and nobody saw. People saw, Wyatt said quietly. They just didn't look. Eleanor's phone rang at 6:30 p.m. Not a real phone. There was no phone in her room, but the burner cell Cole had managed to slip through her barred window the previous night, wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound when it landed on her floor. She'd hidden it in the same hole in her mattress where the camera had been pulling it out only when she was certain Garrett wasn't nearby, wasn't listening, wasn't testing her with unexpected visits. The screen showed a number she recognized. Cole, Eleanor answered on the second ring, her voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, tomorrow, Friday, 10 a.m. Sheriff's coming to interview you. Get your statement on record. You'll need to let him in. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. Garrett will be at work. We know. We've been tracking his schedule. He leaves at 8:45, doesn't come back until lunch. You'll have 90 minutes minimum. What do I need to do? Just tell the truth. Everything you wrote in the notebooks, everything he's done. They'll document the room, take photographs, get it all on record. Eleanor closed her eyes. Tomorrow. Tomorrow the evidence would be official. Tomorrow someone with a badge and authority would see what she'd been living through. Tomorrow she'd stop being invisible. Okay, she said. I'll be ready. Eleanor. Cole's voice carried something she hadn't heard before. Gentleness. This is almost over. You understand that you're almost free. I'll believe it when the door locks from the inside, she said. She heard what might have been a smile in his response. Fair enough. We'll make sure it does. After he hung up, Eleanor sat in the darkness of her room, the burner phone hidden back in the mattress, and allowed herself something she'd rationed even more carefully than food or warmth. She allowed herself hope. Friday morning arrived with cloud cover that threatened rain, but hadn't yet delivered. Eleanor heard Garrett's car leave at 8:43, 2 minutes earlier than usual, and wondered if his nervousness was making him sloppy or more careful. She decided it didn't matter. Not anymore. At 9:58, she picked her lock and opened her door from the inside, leaving it unlatched so Sheriff Raines wouldn't have to break in. She sat on her bed and waited. At 10:03, she heard footsteps in the breezeway, a knock on her door, firm but not aggressive. Mrs. Hartwell, this is Sheriff Tom Raines. I'm here with Detective Nora Sterling. May we come in? Eleanor stood, smoothed her hands over her worn cardigan and said, Yes, please. The door opened. Two people entered. Tom Raines, who she vaguely recognized from town, though they'd never spoken directly, and a woman in her late 30s, dark hair pulled back, eyes that looked like they'd seen too much suffering and still managed to care. Detective Sterling spoke first. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm Nora Sterling, Financial Crimes Division. We're here because some people who care about you brought us evidence that you might be in danger. Is it all right if we talk to you about your living situation? Eleanor looked at these two representatives of a system that had failed to see her for 3 years, that had believed Garrett every time she'd tried to signal for help and made a choice. She would trust them, not because they'd earned it, but because the alternative was dying in this room. Yes, Eleanor said, I have a lot to tell you. They spent the next 70 minutes documenting everything. Detective Sterling recorded Eleanor's statement on video, asking questions that were direct but not unkind. What were her living conditions? When had the restrictions started? Had she consented to any of this? Did she have independent access to her finances? Her medical care. The outside world. To each question, Eleanor answered with the precision of someone who'd been rehearsing these answers for 2 years, waiting for someone to finally ask. No, she hadn't consented. No, she had no access to her money. No, she hadn't seen a doctor in over a year, despite Garrett claiming to pick up her prescriptions. No, she couldn't leave. The door was locked from the outside. Sheriff Raines photographed everything. The barred window, the broken heater, the lock mechanism on the outside of her door, the tiny refrigerator that held 3 days of food rationed into portions that wouldn't sustain a child, much less a 70-year-old woman. Detective Sterling, arm in Eleanor's arms, where bruises in various stages of healing showed the outline of fingers gripping too hard. Documented the weight loss, the way Eleanor's clothes hung loose on a frame that had once been fuller. Asked if Eleanor would consent to a medical examination. Eleanor agreed. At 11:17, Sheriff Raines' phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then at Detective Sterling. We need to move. Subject's heading back early. Eleanor felt ice slide down her spine. Garrett's coming. Got a call from one of Cole's guys watching the bank. Garrett left 15 minutes ago, looks agitated. We've got maybe 10 minutes before he's here. Detective Sterling helped Eleanor to her feet. Mrs. Hartwell, we can take you with us now, get you somewhere safe. Eleanor shook her head. No, if I leave before you arrest him, he destroys evidence. You said you need to search his house, his computer. If I'm gone, he'll know something's wrong. Ma'am, if he's coming back early because he suspects something, then he'll come to this room to check on me, and I'll be exactly where he left me. Eleanor's voice was steady. I've survived 3 years. I can survive one more day. Rains and Sterling exchanged glances. Professional disagreement written in the set of their shoulders, but also professional respect for someone making an informed choice about their own risk. We'll have unmarked units watching the house, Rains said. If anything happens, anything at all, we move in immediately. How will I signal? Sterling pulled out a small device no bigger than a car key fob. Panic button. Press it once we come running. Keep it hidden. Eleanor took the device, closed her fingers around it. Solid, real, a lifeline. Tomorrow, Rains said. We execute the search warrant tomorrow morning. Get everything we need to charge him. Can you hold on until tomorrow? Eleanor thought about 3 years of holding on. 3 years of counting days and reciting poetry and building evidence and refusing to let Garrett's slow murder succeed. One more day was nothing. Yes, she said, I can hold on. They left through the breezeway as quietly as they'd come, taking their evidence and their recordings and leaving Eleanor alone in her prison, the panic button hidden in her pocket, the knowledge that tomorrow everything would change, burning in her chest like a second heartbeat. She arranged herself on the bed positioned exactly as she'd been when Garrett had last seen her, and waited. 6 minutes later, she heard his car, heard his footsteps faster than usual, agitated. The outer door opened. Garrett appeared in her doorway, his tie loosened, his expression tight with something that might have been panic. Aunt Ellie. His voice was too controlled, too careful. How are you feeling? Eleanor looked up at him with the vacant expression she'd perfected, the one that said, confused old woman who barely knows what day it is. Fine, Garrett. Just tired. He studied her for a long moment, searching for evidence that she'd been anywhere other than this bed, that anyone had been here, that his carefully constructed prison had been breached. Eleanor held his gaze, letting him see nothing but the helpless elderly aunt he needed her to be. Finally, Garrett nodded. I brought lunch early. Thought you might be hungry. He handed her a sandwich, turkey and cheese with the crusts cut off, and Eleanor took it with trembling hands that weren't entirely performance anymore. Thank you, she said softly. Garrett lingered in the doorway, his unease palpable. Did anyone come by today? Anyone knock on the door? Eleanor blinked at him, confusion carefully calibrated. I don't think so. I was sleeping. You're sure? I sleep a lot lately. I'm always so tired. Something in Garrett's posture relaxed slightly. He was convincing himself that his paranoia was unfounded, that the pressure he'd been feeling was just stress, just his own guilt manifesting as anxiety. He was wrong, but Eleanor wasn't going to correct him. Rest well, Aunt Ellie, Garrett said, and locked the door behind him as he left. Eleanor sat alone in her room, the sandwich untouched beside her, the panic button in her pocket, a reminder that she wasn't as alone as Garrett believed. She'd spent 3 years being invisible, being overlooked, being erased one day at a time. Tomorrow she would become undeniable. Tomorrow the woman who wouldn't disappear would make absolutely certain that everyone saw exactly what Garrett Voss had done. And when the evidence was documented and the charges were filed and the handcuffs finally closed around his wrists, Eleanor would do something she hadn't done in 3 years. She would walk out of this room on her own terms, head high, spirit unbroken, and she would never, ever come back. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Her mind was too full of tomorrow, of the search warrant being executed, of Garrett's face when he finally understood that his respectable facade had cracked wide enough to show the monster underneath. She heard him moving around the main house, his footsteps pacing the floor above her converted garage prison. Back and forth, the rhythm of someone who couldn't settle, couldn't rest. He knew something was wrong. Maybe not the specifics, maybe not that law enforcement was building a case against him, but he knew. Predators have instincts too, and Garrett's were screaming that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. At 2:17 a.m., Eleanor heard his footsteps stop outside her door. The lock turned. The door opened. Garrett stood silhouetted against the dim light from the breezeway, and for a terrible moment, Eleanor thought he'd decided to end this tonight, to finish what he'd started before whatever investigation he sensed could complete. Her hand found the panic button in her pocket. Aunt Ellie, Garrett's voice was soft, almost gentle. The same voice he used when other people were around when he needed to maintain the performance of caring nephew. Are you awake? Eleanor made herself breathe slowly, evenly, the rhythm of sleep. Didn't respond. Garrett stepped into the room. She could hear him moving closer, could feel his presence beside her bed. Every muscle in her body wanted to flinch away, to run, to press the button and summon help. But running now would show her hand, would reveal that she was aware, alert, not the declining old woman he needed her to be. So Eleanor lay still and pretended to sleep while her nephew stood over her in the darkness. I'm sorry, Garrett whispered so quietly she almost didn't hear it. I never meant for it to go this far. I just needed the money, just needed to fix things. And then you had so much, and I had nothing, and it seemed fair somehow. It seemed like you owed me. Eleanor's jaw clenched behind closed eyes. She owed him nothing. Nothing except perhaps the lesson that stealing someone's life, their freedom, their dignity carries consequences. Tomorrow he'd learn that lesson. But now something's wrong, Garrett continued, his voice taking on an edge of panic. I can feel it, people watching. That biker, those questions at the bank. Something's coming apart. Eleanor felt the mattress shift as Garrett sat down on the edge of her bed, felt his hand touch her shoulder, not roughly, almost tenderly. I should have been better to you, he said. I should have just asked for the money. Maybe you would have helped me, but I was ashamed, and shame makes people cruel. He stood, paced to the window, then back. Eleanor could track his movement by sound, by the displacement of air, by the predator awareness she'd developed over 3 years of captivity. Tomorrow I'm going to fix this, Garrett said, speaking to himself now, more than to her unconscious form. Tomorrow I'm going to move you somewhere safe, somewhere better. Wyoming, that facility in Sheridan. They have good care there. You'll be comfortable. Eleanor knew what comfortable meant in Garrett's vocabulary. It meant out of state, out of reach. Where Montana's investigators couldn't easily follow, where Riverside's community wouldn't ask questions, where an old woman dying in a nursing home would be unremarkable, expected, thoroughly unsuspicious. It meant the endgame, the final phase of his plan. I'll tell everyone you wanted to go, Garrett continued, working through his justification aloud, that you asked for specialized care. People will believe me. They always believe me. He moved to the door, paused. Sleep well, Aunt Ellie. Tomorrow everything changes. The door closed, the lock engaged. His footsteps retreated. Eleanor opened her eyes in the darkness and pulled out the burner phone Cole had given her. Texted 3 words, "He's moving me." The response came 30 seconds later. Not happening. Units are watching. If he tries to take you, we intercede. You're protected. Eleanor stared at the words on the glowing screen. Protected. After 3 years of being systematically unprotected by every system that should have seen what was happening, the word felt foreign. But she was learning to trust it, learning that sometimes help did come, that sometimes asking to sit down led to people standing up for you, that invisibility could be reversed if enough people decided to actually look. She deleted the text, hid the phone, and lay back down on her narrow bed. Tomorrow, Garrett thought he was moving her to Wyoming, to the final stage of his murder plan, disguised as care. Tomorrow, what would actually happen was Sheriff Raines executing a search warrant, Detective Sterling documenting 3 years of systematic abuse, and Eleanor Hartwell finally being believed by the people with power to do something about it. Tomorrow, the invisible woman would become impossible to ignore. Eleanor closed her eyes and did what she'd done for 3 years. She pulled out her current notebook, the one she'd been keeping since Cole had slipped her the burner phone, and by the faint light of the street lamp outside her barred window, she wrote one final entry. March 27th, 2024. Tomorrow. Tomorrow, I stop being a prisoner and start being a survivor. Tomorrow, Garrett stops being my jailer and starts being an inmate. Tomorrow, the world will see what I've known for 3 years, that respectability is a mask, that silence is complicity, and that an old woman asking to sit down can change everything. Tomorrow, I become unforgettable. But tonight, I'm still here, still breathing, still fighting, still refusing to disappear. One more night, then freedom. She closed the notebook, hid it back in its place, and lay down on her narrow bed for what she hoped would be the last time. Eleanor recited Tennyson one more time, the words she'd been holding on to like a rope in darkness. Though much is taken, much abides. And though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, we are. One equal temper of heroic hearts made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive to seek to find and not to yield. She had not yielded, would not yield, not tonight, not tomorrow, not ever. At 70 years old, locked in a converted garage, starved and frozen and systematically erased, Eleanor Hartwell was still here, still fighting, still documenting, still refusing to disappear. And tomorrow, everyone would finally see what she'd known all along. That being underestimated was sometimes the greatest advantage of all. Saturday morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of Montana dawn that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Eleanor woke at 5:47 a.m., not because her body needed less sleep, but because anticipation had wound her nerves too tight for rest. She knew Garrett was awake too. Could hear him moving around upstairs, the floorboards creaking under anxious pacing. He'd been up most of the night, she suspected, planning his move, convincing himself that taking her to Wyoming today instead of waiting was the right call, the safe call. He had no idea how wrong he was. At 7:15, Garrett appeared at her door with breakfast. Oatmeal lukewarm, a glass of water. His smile was strained, his eyes carrying the red-rimmed exhaustion of someone who'd spent the night wrestling with demons. "Good morning, Aunt Ellie," he said, his voice too bright, too forced. "I hope you slept well. We have a big day ahead." Eleanor looked up at him with the confused expression she'd perfected. "Do we?" "Yes, I've arranged for you to visit a care facility. Very nice place, much better equipped than what I can provide here. They have nurses' activities, other people your age." "I don't want to go anywhere," Eleanor said, letting her voice quaver, letting herself sound exactly like the frightened old woman Garrett needed her to be. "I know change is scary," Garrett said, his tone patronizing paternal. "But trust me, this is what's best. I'll come visit every week." Liar. The word burned in Eleanor's throat, but she swallowed it, kept her face vacant, her posture defeated. When she asked, "This morning, I've already packed a bag for you. We'll leave at 9. 9 o'clock. The search warrant was being executed at 8:30. Garrett didn't know it, but he had 30 minutes of freedom left. Eleanor nodded slowly as if processing information through fog. "Okay, Garrett, if you think it's best." Relief flooded his features. "I do. Eat your breakfast. I'll be back in an hour to help you get ready." He left, locking the door behind him, and Eleanor set aside the oatmeal untouched. Her stomach was too knotted for food, her entire body thrumming with the knowledge that the next hour would determine everything. At 8:29, she heard vehicles pulling up outside. Multiple vehicles, their engines cutting simultaneously, doors opening and closing with the efficient rhythm of coordinated action. Then voices. Sheriff Raines, his tone carrying the authority of someone serving a legal warrant. "Garrett Voss Sheriff's Department. We have a warrant to search these premises." Eleanor moved to her barred window, pressed her face against the metal to see. The driveway was full. 2 sheriff's vehicles, an unmarked sedan that probably belonged to Detective Sterling, and standing near the street engines idling 3 motorcycles. Cole Wyatt and another club member she didn't recognize. Not participating in the official action, but present, watching, making sure Garrett understood he had no way out. She heard Garrett's voice pitched high with panic. "What is this about? I don't understand. There must be some mistake." "No mistake, Mr. Voss." That was Detective Sterling, her voice level and implacable. "We have evidence of elder abuse, financial exploitation, and false imprisonment. We're here to execute a legal search of your property and computers." "This is insane. My aunt is fine. She's right here. She's just confused. She has dementia." "We've spoken to your aunt." Sheriff Raines cut him off. "At length. She's quite lucid, Mr. Voss. More lucid than you'd like people to believe." Silence. Eleanor could picture Garrett's face the moment the truth hit him, the realization that his carefully constructed narrative was collapsing. "I want to speak to my lawyer," Garrett said. "That's your right. You'll have that opportunity. In the meantime, this search is happening. You can cooperate, or you can be detained while we execute the warrant." "Your choice." Footsteps approached Eleanor's door. She stepped back from the window as the lock turned. Sheriff Raines entered, followed by Detective Sterling and a crime scene technician carrying a camera. "Mrs. Hartwell," Raines said gently, "we're going to document everything now. Are you all right?" Eleanor nodded, found her voice steady despite 3 years of it being suppressed. I'm fine, better than fine. You came. We came, Sterling confirmed. And we're not leaving until we have everything we need to make sure you never have to come back here. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of documentation. Technicians photographed every inch of Eleanor's room. The barred window measured and cataloged. The broken heater examined and tested, its dysfunction recorded. The lock on the outside of the door, its mechanism photographed from every angle. They found Eleanor's hidden composition notebooks, the ones she'd kept current, documenting the past few months. Found the disposable camera she'd mentioned, even though Cole had already retrieved and developed it. Found the burner phone which Eleanor handed over willingly. In Garrett's office, they imaged his computer hard drive. Found the search history Eleanor had photographed, along with months of additional searches she hadn't seen. Found financial records showing systematic theft. Found forged medical documents, templates for doctors' signatures, prescription pads that should never have been in civilian hands. They found in a locked drawer in Garrett's desk a draft obituary for Eleanor Hartwell. Already written, dated 3 weeks in the future. Detective Sterling showed it to Eleanor, her expression carefully neutral, professional, but her eyes carrying fury. He wrote this 6 days ago. Eleanor read the words Garrett had composed for her death. Beloved aunt, peacefully in her sleep. Private cremation. Memorial donations to the Alzheimer's Association. Every word a lie. Every sentiment false. Even in death, he'd planned to control her narrative. Can I keep this? Eleanor asked. Sterling hesitated. It's evidence. I know, but after the trial, can I have it? Why would you want it? Eleanor met Sterling's eyes. Because I want to remember what I survived. I want to remember that he planned my ending and I wrote a different one. Sterling's expression softened. After the trial, yes, you can have it. At 10:47 a.m., Sheriff Raines placed Garrett Voss under arrest. The charges read from a prepared document were extensive. Financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, false imprisonment, forgery, identity theft, attempted murder based on the documented conditions and Garrett's own research into methods of causing death that could appear natural. Garrett stood in his driveway, hands cuffed behind his back, his face ashen. He looked at Eleanor, standing in the doorway of what had been her prison, flanked by law enforcement. Aunt Ellie, he said, his voice breaking, please tell them this is a misunderstanding. Tell them I was trying to help you. Eleanor looked at the man who'd locked her away, starved her, frozen her, tried to erase her from existence while stealing everything she had. The man who'd planned her death and written her obituary before she'd even stopped breathing. No, she said clearly, I won't tell them that, because it would be a lie, and I'm done lying to protect you. Garrett's face crumpled. I'm sorry, I was desperate. I didn't know what else to do. You could have asked for help, Eleanor said. You could have been honest. You could have been human. Instead, you chose to be a thief and a coward. They put Garrett in the back of a sheriff's vehicle and drove him away. Eleanor watched until the car disappeared around the corner, until the man who'd controlled every aspect of her life for 3 years was finally definitively gone. Cole approached from where he'd been standing by his motorcycle. Ma'am, you okay? Eleanor turned to him, this stranger who'd said yes when she'd asked to sit down, who'd believed her when belief was the rarest currency in her world. I'm free, she said, and her voice broke on the word, 3 years of holding herself together, finally fracturing now that it was safe to break. Cole nodded, didn't try to comfort her with empty words or awkward touches, just stood there solid and present, while Eleanor Hartwell cried for the first time since Garrett had locked her away. 9 months passed between arrest and trial. 9 months during which Eleanor learned to be free again. It wasn't as simple as she'd imagined. Freedom, it turned out, required practice, required relearning how to make choices without calculating whether they'd anger her jailer, required accepting that she could walk out a door and it would still be unlocked when she returned. She moved into a small apartment at Riverside Senior Living, a place she'd chosen herself where the door locked from the inside and the heat worked and no one rationed her food. The first night there, she'd woken at 2 a.m. in a panic, certain she'd hear Garrett's footsteps, certain the freedom was a dream she'd wake from. But the footsteps never came. The nightmare was over. The dream was real. Cole visited every Tuesday, not as a rescuer, not as a guardian, but as a friend. They'd sit at Riverside Diner at the same table where this had all begun, And sometimes they talked, and sometimes they didn't, and both were equally comfortable. You don't have to keep checking on me, Eleanor told him once. Not checking on you, Cole replied. Having coffee with a friend, different thing. Eleanor smiled. Is it? Yeah, friends choose to show up. Checking on someone is an obligation. I'm not obligated to be here. Then why are you? Cole was quiet for a moment, his scarred hands wrapped around his coffee mug. Because you asked to sit down and I said yes. And that yes didn't come with an expiration date. Eleanor learned what it meant to have people who showed up without being asked. Cole and his club, yes, but others too. Faye, the waitress, who'd remembered her $20 tip and had testified at the preliminary hearing. Mrs. Patterson from the library, who cried when she apologized for calling Garrett that day. Father Miguel, who visited weekly to pray with her, though Eleanor suspected he was doing more penance than prayer. Even Linda Kowalski, the neighbor who'd given Eleanor's note back to Garrett, found the courage to knock on Eleanor's apartment door. I'm sorry, Linda said, standing in the hallway with tears streaming down her face. I should have believed you. I should have asked questions. Eleanor could have turned her away. Could have let Linda carry that guilt as payment for her complicity. Instead, she invited her in for tea. You believed what you were conditioned to believe, Eleanor said, as they sat in her small kitchen. That respectable people tell the truth, that old women are confused, that family takes care of family. None of those beliefs are wrong, but Garrett used them as weapons. I still should have known. Maybe, but you know now, and you can use that knowledge to help the next person. That's all any of us can do. Linda became one of Eleanor's most frequent visitors, became in time a friend, became living proof that people could learn, could grow, could choose differently the second time. The trial began on a cold Monday in January, 10 months after Eleanor's rescue. The courthouse was packed. Riverside wasn't a large town, and a case like this, elder abuse and attempted murder, drew attention the way blood draws sharks. Eleanor sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, flanked by Cole and Detective Sterling. She dressed carefully that morning. Navy blue suit, the kind she used to wear to parent-teacher conferences. Hair styled, makeup applied with a steady hand. She wanted the jury to see a competent woman, not a victim, though she supposed she was both. Garrett sat at the defense table in a suit that probably cost more than Eleanor's monthly pension. His lawyer, Bill Henderson, was one of those attorneys who specialized in making guilty people look sympathetic. He'd already started working the angles in pretrial motions, suggesting that Garrett had been an overwhelmed caregiver, that his actions came from stress and poor judgment rather than malice. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Richard Owens, had a different story to tell. And over the course of 3 weeks, they told it with brutal precision. They presented the bank records showing systematic theft. $3,800 a month for 3 years, totaling over $136,000, stolen from Eleanor's pension alone. They presented the forged prescriptions, complete with testimony from Dr. Morrison, who stated unequivocally that she'd never prescribed Alzheimer's medication to Eleanor Hartwell and had never authorized anyone else to do so on her behalf. They presented photographs of Eleanor's room, the bars, the outside lock, the broken heater, the mini fridge with its pathetic contents. They presented Garrett's computer search history, each query more damning than the last. How long does hypothermia take an elderly? Starvation timeline symptoms? Wyoming nursing homes, Montana death investigation protocols. And they presented the draft obituary, the one Garrett had written 3 weeks before he planned to move Eleanor out of state. The prosecution also called Wade Mitchell, the private investigator Garrett had hired in the final weeks. Mitchell testified reluctantly, his jaw tight. Mr. Voss contacted me in late March, asked me to investigate a motorcycle club, said they were harassing him. Did you find evidence of harassment? D.I. Owens asked. No, I found evidence of surveillance. Legal surveillance, the kind people do when they're watching someone they suspect of criminal activity. Mitchell looked at Garrett with something like disgust. When I told Mr. Voss that the Hells Angels weren't breaking any laws, he got agitated, asked if I could make them go away. I declined. That's when I knew something was very wrong with his story. What did you do? I contacted Sheriff Raines, told him I'd been approached by someone who seemed more worried about being watched than about actual threats. Turned over my notes. It's the only time in 20 years I've violated client confidentiality, and I'd do it again. But the most powerful evidence wasn't digital or photographic or even testimonial. It was Eleanor herself. On day 7 of the trial, Eleanor Hartwell took the stand. The courtroom was silent as Eleanor settled into the witness chair. Every eye was on her, this 71-year-old woman who'd survived 3 years of systematic erasure and lived to tell about it. District Attorney Owens approached, his expression respectful. "Mrs. Hartwell, please state your full name for the record." "Eleanor Marie Hartwell." "And how old are you, Mrs. Hartwell?" 71. I'll be 72 in April." "Thank you. Mrs. Hartwell, do you see the defendant Garrett Voss in the courtroom today?" Eleanor looked at Garrett. He was staring at the table, couldn't meet her eyes. "Yes, he's sitting at the defense table." "And what is your relationship to Mr. Voss?" "He's my nephew. His mother, Patricia, was my younger sister. She died in 2010. Owens nodded. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'm going to ask you to describe the living conditions you experienced from November 2021 to March 2024. Take your time. Tell the jury in your own words what happened." Eleanor took a breath. She'd prepared for this moment, had rehearsed in her mind what she would say, but now that it was here, the words felt heavier than she'd expected. "In November 2021, Garrett convinced me to move into his house. He said I was getting older, that living alone wasn't safe. I trusted him. He was family, my sister's son. I thought he wanted to help me." Her voice was steady, clear, the voice of a teacher who'd spent decades commanding attention in classrooms full of restless children. "At first, everything seemed normal. He gave me a room in the converted garage, said it was temporary just until he could prepare a better space. But the better space never materialized." Eleanor described the progression: the car keys taken, the phone disconnected, the friends and church activities cut off one by one until her entire world consisted of a 10 by 12 room and the nephew who controlled access to everything beyond it. In September 2022, Garrett installed a lock on my door, on the outside. He said it was for my safety, so I wouldn't wander at night. But I've never wandered in my life. The lock wasn't to keep me safe, it was to keep me controlled. She described the cold, the hunger, the isolation that stretched from days into weeks, into months, into years. By 2023, I understood what was happening. Garrett was stealing my money, stealing my freedom, building a narrative that I was declining, that I had dementia, so that when I died, no one would question it. They'd just think, poor old Ellie, her mind was going, at least she's at peace now. Owens held up the draft obituary. "Mrs. Hartwell, do you recognize this document?" Eleanor looked at it. "Yes, that's the obituary Garrett wrote for me while I was still alive." "He wrote this in March 2024, is that correct?" "Yes, 6 days before Sheriff Raines executed the search warrant." "What does that tell you, Mrs. Hartwell?" Eleanor met Garrett's eyes. He was looking at her now, his face pale, his hands clasped so tightly on the table that his knuckles showed white. "It tells me he'd decided it was time. Time to finish what he'd started. Time to move me somewhere I couldn't be found, couldn't be heard. Time to let the cold, or the hunger, or the isolation do what he didn't have the courage to do with his own hands." "And did he have the courage to face you now?" Owens asked. "Objection." Henderson stood, argumentative. "Sustained," Judge Morrison said. Owens nodded. "I'll rephrase. Mrs. Hartwell, in all the time Garrett held you in that room, did he ever acknowledge what he was doing? Did he ever admit the truth?" Eleanor thought about the night before the raid, Garrett standing over her bed in the darkness, whispering his apologies to someone he thought was asleep. "Once," she said, "the night before he was arrested, he came to my room while he thought I was sleeping. He said he was sorry, said he'd never meant for it to go this far. But even then, even in his apology, he was justifying it, saying he needed the money, that I had so much and he had nothing, as if that made it right, as if my life was worth less than his debt." The courtroom was utterly silent. "Mrs. Hartwell," Owens said quietly, "what was the hardest part of those 3 years? What was the thing that nearly broke you?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was softer, but no less clear. "Not the cold, not the hunger, not even the fear, though the fear was constant. The hardest part was believing that no one cared enough to look, that I could disappear and the world would just accept Garrett's explanation. That respectability mattered more than truth. That being old meant being invisible. She looked at the jury, these 12 strangers who held Garrett's fate in their hands. I taught second grade for 34 years in this town. I taught some of your children. Some of you, maybe. I was part of this community. And yet for 3 years I vanished and no one noticed. No one asked questions. No one looked past Garrett's smile and his press shirts and his volunteer work to see what he was doing behind closed doors. But someone did notice, Owens prompted. Yes, a stranger in a leather vest. A man I'd never met. He said yes when I asked to sit down, and that yes saved my life. Owens let that statement hang in the air for a moment. Then no further questions. Bill Henderson stood for cross-examination. He was good at his job. Eleanor had to give him that. He tried every angle. Wasn't it possible she'd been confused? No, Eleanor answered. She'd kept detailed journals, complex records. Confused people don't maintain that level of documentation. Wasn't it possible Garrett had been overwhelmed, that his actions came from stress rather than malice? No, Eleanor answered. Malice is planning someone's death while they're still alive. Malice is researching how long it takes to kill someone through neglect. Malice is writing an obituary before the person has died. Wasn't it possible she was exaggerating, that the conditions weren't as bad as she claimed? Eleanor looked at Henderson with the expression she'd used on particularly difficult students, the ones who tried to lie their way out of consequences. Mr. Henderson, she said, I have photographs of that room, medical records of my weight loss, bank statements of my stolen pension, my nephew's own computer showing he researched methods of killing me. Which part exactly do you think I'm exaggerating? Henderson had no good answer to that. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. The verdict came back guilty on all counts. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks after the verdict. Eleanor attended, sitting in the same front row seat wearing the same Navy suit. Garrett was given the opportunity to speak before the judge imposed sentence. He stood, his suit rumpled, now his face carrying the marks of 6 weeks in county jail awaiting this moment. Your Honor, Garrett began, his voice shaking, I want to apologize to my Aunt Ellie. I was drowning in debt. I made terrible choices. I never meant to hurt her. I just wanted to fix my life. Judge Morrison, a woman in her 60s who'd presided over 3 decades of cases and had probably heard every excuse imaginable, looked at Garrett with an expression that could have frozen water. Mr. Voss, she said, you had many opportunities to fix your life. You could have declared bankruptcy. You could have asked your aunt for help honestly. You could have gotten a second job or moved to a cheaper city or made any number of legal, ethical choices. She picked up the draft obituary from her desk. Instead, you chose to imprison a 70-year-old woman. You stole her money, her freedom, and nearly her life. You researched methods of killing her. You wrote her obituary while she was still breathing. And you did all of this while presenting yourself to this community as a caring nephew. Judge Morrison set down the obituary. This court has reviewed the evidence, the systematic nature of your abuse, the premeditation of your actions, the complete absence of remorse until you were caught. Taking all of this into consideration, the court sentences you to 25 years in the Montana State Prison with no possibility of parole for 15 years. Garrett's knees buckled. His lawyer caught him. Additionally, Judge Morrison continued, you are ordered to pay restitution of $180,000 to Mrs. Hartwell, representing the pension funds you stole plus accrued interest. Your property is forfeit to satisfy this debt. The judge looked at Eleanor. Mrs. Hartwell, do you wish to make a statement? Eleanor stood. She'd prepared something, had written it out and practiced it. But now, standing in this courtroom with Garrett's fate sealed and her freedom secured, the prepared words felt wrong. So she spoke from her heart instead. Garrett, she said, and he turned to look at her, tears streaming down his face. You asked me to tell them this was a misunderstanding, to say you were trying to help me. I won't do that because it would dishonor everything I survived. She stepped into the aisle closer to him. But I will tell you this, I forgive you for what you did. Not because you deserve forgiveness, but because carrying hatred for you would give you power over me even now. And I'm done giving you power. Garrett sobbed. But I'll never forgive you for who you became, Eleanor continued. You had a choice every day, every hour, every moment. You had a choice. You chose greed over humanity. You chose comfort over conscience. You chose to erase a person rather than admit you needed help. She looked at the judge, then back at Garrett. I lost 3 years of my life to you. 3 years I'll never get back. But you've lost something more. You've lost the ability to look in a mirror without seeing a monster. And that's a sentence that will last long after you leave prison. Eleanor sat down. The bailiffs took Garrett away. He looked back, once his face a mask of anguish and regret. Eleanor didn't look away. Let him see that she was still here, still strong, still unbroken despite his best efforts to break her. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Eleanor had avoided them throughout the trial, but today she stopped. Mrs. Hartwell, how does it feel to get justice? One asked. Eleanor considered the question. Justice feels necessary, but it's not the same as healing. Healing is what comes next. What do you want people to learn from your story? Eleanor looked at the crowd of reporters, cameras, curious onlookers. Behind them, Cole leaned against his motorcycle, waiting to make sure she got home safe. Beside him, Wyatt and 3 other club members, a wall of leather and loyalty. I want people to learn that invisible doesn't mean gone, Eleanor said. That quiet doesn't mean consent. That age doesn't mean disposable. I want people to look at their elderly neighbors, their aging parents, their grandmothers sitting alone in diners and actually see them. What will you do now? Another reporter asked. Eleanor smiled. It was the first time in years that smile came naturally. I'm going to live, she said, loudly, visibly, undeniably. I'm going to make sure that the 3 years Garrett stole don't define the rest of my story. She walked away from the courthouse steps, past the reporters, toward Cole and the club members who'd helped save her. Ready? Cole asked. Ready. They rode together to Riverside Diner, a convoy of motorcycles and one elderly woman who'd learned that salvation sometimes came from the most unexpected places. 3 months after Garrett's sentencing, Eleanor Hartwell stood in the Riverside Diner at noon on a Tuesday, looking at a small brass plaque mounted beside the corner booth where she'd first asked Cole if she could sit down. The plaque read, "The last seat, reserved for anyone eating alone, in memory of every invisible person who just needed someone to say yes." Bob Henley, the diner owner, stood beside her, wringing his hands nervously. Is it okay? I wanted to do something to remember to make sure it never happens again. And I thought, it's perfect, Eleanor said, touching the plaque gently. Thank you, Bob. The Last Seat program had been Eleanor's idea, but it had grown beyond anything she'd imagined. Every Tuesday, volunteers rotated through the diner, sitting with seniors who came in alone, offering conversation, offering presence, offering the simple acknowledgement that they existed and mattered. Cole was here as he was every Tuesday. Wyatt, Faye the waitress who'd remembered Eleanor's $20 tip, Mrs. Patterson from the library, Father Miguel, Linda Kowalski, and others. New faces each week. People who'd heard Eleanor's story and decided they didn't want to be the ones who looked away next time. I have something for you, Detective Sterling said, appearing with a manila envelope. From evidence. The trial's over, appeals are filed. These are yours now if you want them. Eleanor opened the envelope. Inside the notebook she'd kept, the photographs, the draft obituary. She'd asked for the obituary specifically. Wanted it as a reminder. Thank you, Eleanor said. What will you do with them? Sterling asked. Eleanor thought for a moment. I'm teaching again, not at the elementary school, I'm too old for that chaos, but at the community college. A class on elder rights, on recognizing abuse, on believing victims, even when it's uncomfortable. She held up the notebooks. These are my textbook, the real story of what systematic erasure looks like, what it feels like, how it progresses. The students need to know. Sterling nodded. You're making sure it means something. The suffering, you're turning it into protection for others. Trying to, Eleanor said. That's all any of us can do. The weeks turned into months. Eleanor's class at the community college grew from 12 students to 47. She taught them to recognize the signs. The isolated elder, the controlling family member, the too good to be true narrative of the caring relative. She taught them that abuse doesn't always look like violence. Sometimes it looks like locked doors and disconnected phones and portions of food that get smaller week by week. She taught them that victims aren't always crying for help in obvious ways. Sometimes they're leaving breadcrumbs, hoping someone will follow the trail. Montana passed Eleanor's law in June, 6 months after the trial. The bill required mandatory welfare checks for any senior who hadn't been seen publicly in 90 days. Required banks to verify transfers over $10,000 from elderly accounts. Increase funding for adult protective services by 40%. Eleanor testified at the state legislature wearing her Navy suit, speaking in that clear teacher's voice that had commanded attention in classrooms for decades. This law won't prevent every case of elder abuse, she told the assembled legislators. But it will make it harder. It will create checkpoints. It will require people to actually verify that the elderly person they're supposedly caring for is alive and well and consenting to their situation. The bill passed 98-2. On the one-year anniversary of her rescue, Eleanor held a gathering at Riverside Community Center. She called it the Survivor's Circle, a monthly meeting for people who'd experienced elder abuse or financial exploitation, a space to share stories and resources and hope. 23 people showed up to the first meeting. By the third meeting, it was 47. By the sixth, they had to move to a larger room. Eleanor stood at the front of that room looking at faces that ranged from 60 to 92 people who'd been isolated, stolen from controlled, erased, and had survived to tell about it. "My name is Eleanor," she said the way she started every meeting. "I'm 72 years old. My nephew held me prisoner for 3 years, stole my money, and tried to kill me. I survived because I refused to disappear, because I documented everything, because I asked a stranger if I could sit down, and he said yes." She paused, looking at each face. "You're here because you survived too, because you found the strength to speak up, to seek help, to refuse to be erased. Some of you are just beginning that journey. Some of you are years past it, but all of you matter. All of you wish to be seen." A woman in the back row, maybe 68, raised her hand tentatively. "I don't know if anyone will believe me. My son is a lawyer. Everyone thinks he's wonderful." Eleanor recognized the fear in that statement, recognized the weight of respectability used as armor against accusations. "I understand," Eleanor said gently. "My nephew was a financial advisor, volunteered at the food bank. Everyone thought he was wonderful too. But here's what I learned: documentation matters more than reputation. Evidence matters more than someone's smile. If you're experiencing abuse, document it. Write it down. Photograph it if you can. Build a case that can't be dismissed." She held up her notebooks, the ones she'd kept for 3 years. "These saved my life, not because they were perfect, but because they were persistent. Because I wrote down the truth every day, even when I thought no one would ever read it." The woman nodded, tears in her eyes. "Thank you." After the meeting, as people mingled over coffee and cookies, Linda Kowalski approached Eleanor. "I've been thinking," Linda said, "about that day I gave your note back to Garrett, about how easily I believed him. Linda, we've talked about this. I know you've forgiven me, but I want to do more than be forgiven. I want to make sure I never make that mistake again. So I've been training to be a victim advocate through the state program. I'm going to work with Adult Protective Services, helping investigate reports of elder abuse, using what I learned, what I should have seen with you, to help others." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "Linda, that's wonderful." "It's not wonderful. It's necessary. It's what I should have been doing all along." They embraced two women who had started on opposite sides of a terrible situation and had found their way to the same side, the side that said, "Never again." 14 months after Garrett's sentencing, Eleanor made a decision that surprised even herself. She requested a visit to Montana State Prison. Cole offered to come with her, so did Detective Sterling. But Eleanor declined both offers. "This is something I need to do alone," she said. The Montana State Prison visiting room smelled like industrial cleaner and desperation. Eleanor sat across from Garrett, separated by reinforced glass phone receivers, connecting them across the divide. He'd aged a decade in 14 months. Gray at the temples, shoulders curved inward. The respectable financial advisor was gone. What remained was a man who'd stared at his choices long enough to understand their weight. "Why did you come?" Garrett asked, his voice hoarse from disuse. Eleanor had asked herself that question every day for a week before making the drive. She'd written speeches, rehearsed arguments, planned exactly what she'd say to the man who'd tried to erase her. But sitting here, looking at him through glass, she found she didn't need speeches. "I came to tell you something I needed to say in person," Eleanor said. Garrett's hands shook as he gripped the phone. "I'm sorry, Aunt Ellie. I've had a lot of time to think, a lot of time to understand what I did. I was desperate. I lost everything. So did I, Garrett. Eleanor's voice was calm, clinical. The voice she'd used when teaching difficult lessons to children who didn't want to learn. I lost my husband, my daughter, my freedom for 3 years. The difference between us is what we chose to do with loss. I chose to rebuild. You chose to destroy. I chose to document and fight. You chose to steal and erase. We both had grief. We both had pain, but I didn't lock anyone in a cage because of mine. Garrett was crying now, silent tears tracking down his face. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. I forgive you for what you did to me. The stealing, the imprisonment, the cold, and the hunger. I forgive all of that because holding on to hatred gives you power over me, and I'm done with that. Hope flickered quiet in Garrett's eyes. But I will never forgive you for who you became when you made those choices. For the man who could write my obituary while I was still breathing. For the man who researched how long it takes an old woman to freeze to death. For the man who saw a human being and calculated her worth in dollars. The hope died. You didn't just commit crimes, Garrett. You committed a moral erasure. You decided I didn't matter enough to exist. And that's something I can forgive but never forget. Eleanor stood, set down the phone. Garrett was saying something, his mouth moving behind the glass, but Eleanor didn't pick up the receiver to hear it. She'd said what she came to say. She walked toward the exit, and this time when Garrett called her name, she didn't pause. Some conversations don't need closure. They need ending. Outside, Cole waited beside his motorcycle as he'd promised. He didn't ask how it went, just handed her a helmet. Ready? He asked. Eleanor looked back at the prison one last time. Somewhere in there, Garrett was learning to live with consequences. Out here, Eleanor was learning to live without them defining her. Ready, she said. They rode back to Riverside where Eleanor had a survivor's circle meeting at 7 and a class to teach tomorrow morning, where she had a life that was hers, a voice that mattered, and a future that Garrett's past couldn't touch. The woman who wouldn't disappear had made sure of that. Cole appeared at Eleanor's elbow as the crowd thinned. Ready to go. Where are we going? Tuesday? Diner? Our ritual. Eleanor smiled. You know you don't have to keep showing up every week. I know. Cole held the door for her. But I choose to anyway. That's what friends do. They sat at the last seat booth, the one with the plaque, the one that had started everything. Faye brought coffee without being asked, knew their orders by heart now. How's the class going? Cole asked. Growing, every semester more students. They want to understand how to protect their grandparents, their aging parents, how to recognize when something's wrong. You're changing things, Cole said, making sure what happened to you doesn't happen to others. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, watching the diner's familiar rhythm, the construction workers finishing lunch, the retired couple debating whether to order pie, a young mother wiping her son's face. You know what I realized, Eleanor said. Garrett didn't just fail to kill me. He created the opposite of what he intended. How so? He tried to make me invisible. Instead, I became impossible to ignore. He tried to erase me. Instead, I became unforgettable. He tried to silence me. Instead, I found a voice that reaches hundreds of people every month. Eleanor smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes. He tried to write my ending, but I wrote a different one, not just for me, for everyone who comes after. That's the legacy he left, though I doubt it's the one he intended. Cole raised his coffee mug. To different endings. Eleanor clinked hers against his. To refusing to disappear. They drank their coffee in comfortable silence. These two unlikely friends who'd found each other in a moment of desperate need and had chosen to keep finding each other long after the desperation had passed. Because that's what the story had really been about all along. Not just survival, though survival mattered. Not just justice, though justice mattered too. It was about the simple human truth that everyone deserves to be seen. That asking for help isn't weakness. That saying yes to someone who needs you isn't heroism, it's just basic decency. And that sometimes in a crowded diner on a Tuesday afternoon when a 70-year-old woman asks a stranger if she can sit down, the answer to that question can change everything. Eleanor Hartwell was 72 years old. She'd been widowed, imprisoned, starved, frozen, and almost erased. But she was still here, not despite what happened, but because of what she'd chosen to do about it. She'd refused to disappear. And in refusing, she'd made sure no one else had to disappear either. That was her ending, not the one Garrett had written, the one she'd written herself. And it was a damn good ending.